All right, Dave. We've now got through the news and our short topics, and we're into the main event. Cyberman, Dave, the Silver Giants at long last.
Yeah, so do you want me to give some opening thoughts, or will you, Rob?
Oh, I think we'll both have something to say, Dave.
Well, look, I'll kick us off because I know you're a big fan, and I struggle sometimes to really know where I land on the Cybermen. I love most of the Cybermen stories. In fact, I love quite a lot of Cybermen stories, certainly in the classic season, certainly in the 60s. I like the idea of the Cybermen, but there's a part of me that feels as though they never quite lived up to their real potential, that they never quite delivered on the premise, and they'd sometimes just almost an incidental monster in an otherwise very good story. And I'm looking forward to teasing this out as to when they work and when they don't, and why they work and why they don't, and maybe I'm overthinking things, and I'm really conflicted on these ones compared to something like the Daleks, which I just say, love the concept, love almost all of their stories, classic. Cyberman's harder for me. So, Rob, you pitched this topic, so I'll ask you, what's your feeling?
I always, you've already touched on something I'm going to pick up on as well, which is I'm not sure they're always used well. And when I go back through the series, I see missed opportunities when it comes to their stories. Interestingly, though, the further we go back, the more I like them, which I think we'll probably tease out as we go through each decade.
Yeah.
But I'll just say up front, yes, they haven't been used well. I think they were better used in the past than they currently are. Having said that, I think their most recent outing on our screens was one of their best ever. So that's...
Yeah, yep.
I don't want to seem like I'm contradicting myself, but gosh, they're sort of a hard thing to love, but love them I do.
Well, let's throw into the 60s then.
Yes.
And I'll start with this opening comment. They appear properly in 5 stories in the 60s, 4 of which are Troughton stories. There is not one on that list that I think is a bad story, and 4 of the 5 I think are in the range of excellent to classic.
Okay, I only slightly disagree insofar as I've never been too fussed on the Moonbase. But 10th Planet, Tomb, Wheel in Space, Invasion, I think are all wonderful.
So they're very good stories there. Are they very good stories because of the Cybermen? Or are they very good stories in which the Cybermen appear? And I think it splits. I think 10th Planet and Tomb are very good stories and very good cyber stories. The Cybermen are integral to those plots. The concept of them is really important and fundamental to those plots. Moonbase, Wheel in Space and Invasion? Could it be any monster? Does it have to be the Cybermen? I think it could. I mean, the Invasion is Tobias Vaughn's story, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a techie edge there too, and I think, it suits the Cybermen more than, say, the Daleks, to use the other big monster in Doctor Who.
That's true, yeah, no, good point, yeah.
But I see what you mean. It doesn't necessarily have to be the Cybermen. If for some reason they couldn't get the rights to them, they could have done something else there, and it would have been like, I don't know, the War Machines or something.
or if it was the white robots from the Mind Robber, that would still work as a story and as a concept. But you're right, though, that the electronic thing comes in. One of the reasons as well why I think 10th Planet and Tomb work is that there is this overt sense through both stories about them being people, humans from a twin planet Mondas and later Telos, who have become cybernized. It's very overt in the 10th Planet. There are those wonderful classic speeches about feelings and, don't you care? Well, there are people dying all over this world. You don't care about them. Why do you just care about this one? And all those wonderful things. Tomb doesn't do it quite as overtly, but you do get the partial cybernization of Toberman and that real dehumanizing of him as part of that process, which is very important. I think it's very telling that the cliffhanger to part 2 of Tomb of the Cybermen is not the big exciting moment of the Cybermen burst from their tombs and then the cyber controller comes out and it's, wow, Cybermen. It's a moment later when the Cyberman says, you belong to us, you will be like us. That's the real threat of the Cybermen, and Tomb's really good like that.
Yeah, look, completely agree with you there. 10th Planet and Tomb sort of do bring out the Cybermen to their fullest. I sometimes wonder whether the black and white era suits the Cybermen. I know that might seem a strange thing to talk about, but it's the only era we're going to look at here that is in black and white. And I just have this feeling that sometimes the Cybermen come across better in black and white. They're almost monochrome, even when they're in colour. So, whereas Daleks, I think, look fantastic in colour. You think of the colour movies from the 60s and how the Daleks would be coloured and they look amazing. Whereas the monochrome type Cybermen, I think, do they sort of work better in the 60s? Just big and menacing and in the shadows a bit. And I don't know.
I definitely think there is. I mean, when you think of some of the best Cybermen scenes from the Moonbase, from Tomb, from Wheel, the sewer scene in the Invasion, they are all ones where they are these sort of semi-lit in the shadows sort of moments when they can loom over people or sneak up on people, and that's really powerful. But the other thing is, and perhaps we can talk a bit about their design here, Rob. The 60s, I guess by reality of budget, has this feeling of not a cobbled together sort of thing, but a very utilitarian sort of design to them, a very sort of practical design to them, in a way that later designs, I think, are still very good, but they look designed. They look as though something with a sense of aesthetics has put them together, rather than something with just a sense of pragmatics.
Yeah, that's right. And I was also going to add, what a clever kind of design. It is a man in a suit, because it is a man in a suit.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean. I think that's one of the cleverest things about the Cybermen, whereas you have other monsters that might be reptile-like and rubber suits and things like that. And you go, well, that's a man in a rubber suit trying to be a reptile. This is, well, it's a man in a suit, but that's exactly what it's meant to be. Oh, my God. You know, I think that's very clever, actually.
I'll ask Rob, is your favourite cyber design in the 60s?
Oh... It's split, and one of the designs is from the 60s.
It's split for me as well, and both of them are. Look, my favourite design is that early Trout and Moonbase Tomb wheel one. I just love the way it's sort of put together, but very close and very worthy is the 10th Planet / World Enough and Time Mondasian design.
Yeah, look, I like that a lot, but my favourite look from the 60s is the Invasion.
Okay.
And it's equal first with the 80s look, and I guess we just call it the Earthshock look.
Yeah, the David Banks look.
Yeah, absolutely. And I note that neither of us like the new Cyberman.
No, but look, we'll talk more about their design when we get there.
Yes.
Interesting contrast I just wanted to make as well between Daleks and Cybermen. When you look at the Dalek stories in the 1960s, 7 parts, 6 parts, 6 parts, 12 parts, 6 parts, 7 parts. Mm-hmm. They're big epic stories. You know, we've got the Daleks who are doing a big thing. Not quite the same as the Cybermen. 4 parts, 4 parts, 4 parts, standard size. 6 for Wheel in Space, and then 8 for the Invasion. And in both those cases, very much, I think, because the production was just desperate to make as much Doctor Who as they could with very little resources, and things were falling through. So quick, add an episode to that one, add 2 to that one, and get them out. So you know, I think the Cybermen have benefited from generally tighter stories.
That is true. I mean, when I look to pull a cyber story off the shelf here at home, it is generally a shorter story, and that's always appreciated, because I have the attention span of a gnat these days, Dave, and that's not Doctor Who's problem, but it certainly does help that these stories are shorter. Yeah, that is interesting, and yet I'm trying to compare the way Daleks are characterised in the 60s and the way Cybermen are characterised. And I'm just trying to think, were they even harder to write for back then? And they didn't want to stretch them out across these long stories.
Yeah, maybe. And that's probably the last point I've got to make for the 60s, is that there is that sort of quest as to how we're going to get them into the dialogue. In the 10th Planet, they're incredibly chatty. And they've got those computerized but quite chatty voices. afterwards, they sort of go back to that very computerized sort of voice. Moonbase, they're just a bunch of Cybermen. Tomb, you get the introduction of the Cyber Controller, which is a one-off at that stage. Mm-hmm. And then you get the Cyber Planner that comes in to wheel an invasion. So there is this sort of quest of, can we get something in there that can talk in a slightly more natural or more detailed thing? And certainly in the case of the Cyber Planner or the Cyber Coordinator, I can't remember which is which, but it's one in one and one in the other. Mm-hmm. Something that can basically be an exposition machine and do a lot of those sort of dialogue dubs. But, as we mentioned earlier, by the invasion, they're actually bringing in Tobias Vaughan, and they've realised that having a human traitor actually is very, very useful for the Cybermen, and is a theme we will be talking about, I suspect.
I think so. I've got to say, out of all the 60s voices, though, I think I prefer the 10th Planet Cyberman.
It is very cool, isn't it? And that effect, and it does carry on with a couple of the Troughton designs as well, that effect of the mouth opening wide and a voice coming out is really, really creepy, really, really dehumanized.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the sing-song style, I just find so, compared to the other voices, which are just more like robot voices, I just find it so much more interesting and creative, actually. I'm surprised they didn't continue with it. And
it's kind of a good example of predicting the future, because we now get those computer voices where it's very clearly a number of syllables. You bring up some answer service or some automatic service, and it's not words. They're very clearly syllables sort of jumped together to make a word by the computer. And it does sound very Cyberman-like, because the intonation's wrong and the inflections are wrong.
Yeah, you have dialed 4, 7, 6, 8, 2, 3. Yeah, I totally understand what you're saying, and you're quite right. Dave, to wrap up on the 60s, I want to say it is, I believe it's my favourite era for the Cybermen. For this show, I've been looking at the full list of stories, and I just think, there's something about that black and white look. There's something about the stories there. Maybe it's because we're seeing these things happen for the first time. Maybe because the stories are pretty straightforward adventures and aren't trying to do really weird stuff like we might get to later, especially in New Who. I have a real fondness for 60s Cybermen in general.
Look, I think it's well established I'm a fan of the 60s, and I totally agree. As I said, all 5 of the cyber stories from the 60s I will very happily watch. I like The Wheel in Space. I think it is the weakest of the bunch. That's probably a fairly popular opinion. I do think it's a very good, fun adventure. 10th Planet is a classic. Tomb is definitely a classic. The Invasion is definitely a classic, and the Moonbase I think is pretty cool as well. So they're just kicking it out of the park in this stage, and you can see why they very quickly earned that reputation as being the number 2 monster.
Absolutely right, because they're first introduced in 66, and we get all these stories by 69, because we're going to talk the 70s now, Dave, and it's slim pickings. There is only one story for the entire decade.
So we're going to talk Revenge of the Cybermen.
Yeah, which takes half a decade to come along, and then there's nothing in the half a decade after that. It is incredible how we go from really ramping these monsters up and looking great in black and white, looking fantastic against Troughton, and poor old Pert doesn't get a go at all. Well, he gets a little go in 5 Doctors, but
No, but I think it's really obvious and really interesting when you look at what that production team and what Pertwee himself enjoyed when they point at races like the Draconians, which were very nuanced, cultured sort of peoples. Pertwee always talks about the use of the half masks in monsters in his era, like the Draconians, where you can see the eyes and the mouth, and you can sort of get that response that I think as an actor he really much preferred. If that's what you're going for, the Cybermen kind of are not that at all. Like, they're the opposite of that.
Yeah, but the counter to that is Pertwee gets a lot of Dalek stories, and to my mind, if you're going to try and play with the idea of people, I know you can't see the eyes and such, but the thought of people being inside the Cybermen versus Daleks, I think they could have mined it a little, because why do all the Dalek stories otherwise?
Well, I guess they saw the Daleks as being a guaranteed ratings success. You put the Daleks in, you get ratings. Maybe they didn't see the Cybermen being like that. Maybe it's just as simple as the fact that people like Kit Pedler had moved on at that stage, or been subtly moved on, and no one else was pitching a Cyberman story. I imagine people are always pitching, hey, I want to do this great Dalek story, and being quietly told by the script editor, well, you don't just get to do a Dalek story, mate.
Yeah, true.
I wonder how, were Bob Baker and Dave Martin sitting there going, I really want to do a Cyberman story? Probably not. And don't forget, the Dalek stories are written by Terry Nation in 2 out of 3 cases, so that's a personal choice he's making, I suppose.
Yeah, that's true. Another thing I'll just throw out there, though, we often talk, well, not just we, but fans in general, talk about the Invasion being, a prototype unit story and a prototype 70s story, and yet the subject of that story doesn't appear in the 70s until 1975 and a whole new Doctor on board.
No, look, it's true, and don't get me wrong. I wish that there had been a cyber story in the Peel era. I think that would have been really good. I think, as you alluded to there, Rob, Unit v Cyberman is a really interesting and very cool concept. But I kind of understand, given what the production team were going for, I get why it didn't happen, I suppose.
Which I guess does bring us to Revenge of the Cybermen. Let's talk about it, Dave. It's not a wonderful story, but it holds a special place in my heart because it was one of the first BBC videos. And for that reason alone, it was something that I could bring home from the video shop and watch over and over and over again. And it's eminently watchable. It's early Tom Baker. It's fantastic. But maybe not a great story in general.
It certainly was, up until the discovery of Tomb, the earliest Cyberman story that was complete. And indeed, of those first 560 stories, we didn't mention that 4 of the 5 of them are incomplete. So therefore, I think it is a lot of people's first exposure to the Cybermen. It was certainly repeated a lot on Australian television. I'm very fond of it. I think it's a really effective story. I like the Cybermen in it. They do appear powerful. I mean, those scenes on Voga where 2 Cybermen sort of almost wipe out the entire planet, it feels like. That is them being treated very seriously. The Doctor is scared of them. Sarah is scared of them. They are not easy to knock out. Even when gold dust is introduced, and that leads me on to another point in a moment, the gold dust still doesn't kill them. They still need to be blown up with a big bomb, or killed by, have the gold injected into them by their own Cybermats. And the Cybermats are terrifying. So there's a lot of good stuff in there, but I want to come back to a point about what Revenge introduces, but I'll let you say a bit more first, Rob.
Yeah, and look, when it's our only Tom Baker Cyberman story, when it's our only 70s Cyberman story, when it's our only colour, well, the first colour Cyberman story, it does sort of, earn a special place just by being all those firsts. But, yeah, I can see the problems with it, at the same time.
You're right. It is flawed in its execution in some ways. Great fun adventure, very fond of it, but it is an imperfect story. But it does set up so much of that 80s David Banks cyber era. The cyber leader, first introduced here. This is the one that really beds down that idea of the human operative or the human traitor that becomes a bit of a theme going on in later ones. Their vulnerability to gold is introduced here. All these sort of little ideas that get used probably better in future stories do come out of Revenge.
Oh, absolutely. These things that I would watch this story and think, oh, well, they're allergic to gold. Oh, okay, that must be how it's always been. And yet that was quite a new thing to be introducing there.
Yeah, absolutely.
After all these 60 stories, suddenly we have all this new information about them. We have the concept of the glitter gun, which sounds very camp now, I think, Dave. The glitter gun, my God. But at the time it sounded, oh, wow, they got this weapon, the glitter gun. Wow, amazing, Yeah. To a kid, I thought this was, quite fun.
Even the idea of the cyber wars having happened a few decades earlier, for example. Again, a big concept that it introduces, I don't think makes full use of. But, yeah, it's a pivotal cyber story, a fun one, an imperfect one.
Yeah, the concept of the cyber wars, we often talk about how we'd like things to be covered with a line. I guess it's a little more than a line, but it does give an excuse for why there's just a few Cybermen in this ship, sort of clunking around the galaxy, because there has been this cyber war. Yes,
very, very much so.
Yeah.
Do we need to probably mention the hands-on hips, slightly more excitable nature of the Cybermen?
Please, go for it.
Look, it is consistently mentioned as the sort of criticism that fanboys make about the series. It never really bothered me until it was pointed out to me, and then I kind of got the criticism. We will talk later about the non-TV iterations of the Cybermen in part, and in The Killing Ground, which features these particular Cybermen, there is actually a comment about how they understand human psychology, and whilst they don't particularly feel the emotion, imitating emotion can help to render humans scared or render humans pliable and that sort of thing, which I think was a nice little bit of retconning.
It is, because, as all fans listening to this will know, that a big thing was made out of they have removed all emotions, and yet we see them on screen being emotional all the time, and it's like, what?
Well, that's right, and I think that we sometimes forget that the removal of emotions doesn't remove the understanding of emotions. The Cybermen are fairly consistently written and portrayed as absolutely understanding emotions. They understand what makes humans tick. They understand how to manipulate them. There's never sort of one of those, is this the human emotion you call friendship? There's none of that sort of stuff going on in there.
Yes, Crichton.
They understand what greed is. They understand what fear is. They understand what loyalty is. So even though they don't personally feel them, they're willing to use them in others. And I think that's a really important distinction.
Yeah, that is a nice way to put it, actually, from that novel. But we'll get there.
We will. So, the 80s.
Oh, the 80s. The 80s start with one of the greatest stories in Doctor Who of all time. And it's a Davo story, Dave. You knew I was going to wax lyrical about this one. It's Earthshock. After 8 years, the Cybermen return. JNT keeps them off the front cover of Radio Times. And I think fans across the UK were genuinely shocked at the end of that first episode when they not only saw Cybermen, but a new design of Cybermen that is equal first. Favourite look for me. I just think 80s Cybermen, when they turned up here, looked amazing. And they still look amazing.
I agree. They still look very, very amazing. To me, they're a little bit over-designed. But that's kind of getting very fanboy in my own sense, and very they're not meant to have a sense of aesthetics. Well, okay, I'm criticising myself again a bit there, but yes, they look amazing. They're introduced in such a good story that is very well written. It's Eric Saywood really probably writing his best script. It's Peter Grimway just coming in and absolutely smashing that direction. Just cut after cut after cut, quick, tight scenes. Money has been spent on this. It is a great introduction, but it does build on the lore as I was talking about before.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, look, absolutely. I think it just picks up where we left off, and, for fans of the show, I mean, a lot of new fans would have been watching this and seeing Cybermen for the first time, but for people who were aware of the Cybermen, there is a sense of continuity here, perhaps, at last. There maybe wasn't as much in the 60s, but here, from Revenge to Earthshock, we do have a sense that, this is all starting to fall into place, and these are the Cybermen. They're allergic to gold, this, that, and the other. That's a good thing. It
is, and again, we see their ability to understand and manipulate humanoids. The way that they manipulate Ringway into becoming a human traitor and betraying his people is very effective. That really good scene where the cyber leader threatens Tegan's life to get the Doctor to do what he wants. And he says, this proves that emotions are a weakness. He knows how it works. He just doesn't feel them himself.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I was watching that scene just the other night. I was watching a YouTube video on the Davison era, and it pulled out that scene. I think more for the when did you last have a well-prepared meal line. I think it was trying to make fun of that. But, we won't go down that rabbit hole. In general, I love the way the cyber leader talks in this story.
Yeah, it's a really good performance. Another reason why this stands out, and I want to do a bit of a sidebar here, Rob, into a bit of a general sort of topic.
Yeah.
One thing that's really interesting about the Cybermen, in the classic series particularly, is that unlike the Daleks, they're never really this big conquering force. The Daleks always had an empire. We always talked about Dalek fleets and thousands of Daleks and Dalek planets. There's always this sense that they were out there. The Cybermen are always just desperate to survive.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a very sort of melancholic, it's a very sad sort of way to be.
Yeah, they're trying to conquer Earth because they need somewhere to establish and to grow. The Tomb of the Cybermen is all about them having run out of power and space and energy and having to sort of recharge for a bit and go into hibernation. The Invasion, they have a big fleet, and that's kind of cool. In Earthshock, they have a big fleet, and that's really cool. But even in Earthshock, they openly make the point that a straight-out battle between the Earth Empire and the Cybermen, they would be defeated. Hence, they're doing this almost terrorism sort of thing. They're going in and, well, let's blow up the planet Earth before we even start the war, because we know we'll be beaten. You can't imagine the Daleks doing that, although the Daleks would have their plague bombs and weaken mankind in different ways. The Daleks always had this idea that, well, if it comes to a straight you versus us, we'll smash you.
Yeah.
Overconfident, it turns out, particularly when the Doctor turns up. But the Cybermen don't have that cockiness. They're always written as being just on the edge of extinction in some ways.
Yeah, and that's probably some of their appeal for me as well. They are on the verge of extinction. They aren't as cocky or brash. Oh, they talk a good game sometimes, but, there is that, as I say, that sadness behind them as well, that they've turned themselves into this race, and where are they going? What are they doing with it? They seem quite doomed.
Yeah, and that's why it's fun to see them in Earthshock at what I think is probably the height of their power, and even that isn't very high.
No, not at all. But Dave, there are two other Cyberman stories in the 80s. I don't think anywhere near as successful or well regarded as Earthshock.
No, certainly not as well regarded. Attack of the Cybermen, I kind of put in there with Revenge as being a pretty decent, fun story. The Cybermen get some cool stuff to do. It's okay. They are at least a powerful and effective force, but again, on the edge of extinction, sort of battling for survival. You get the return of the Cyber Controller. True,
and he's eaten all the pies.
Yes, yeah. Well, there is that wonderful line where the Cyberman in Control turns to him, and I'm sure the line is meant to be, "It is a fat controller," but it certainly sounds like it is a fat controller.
Brilliant. But then moves on to Silver Nemesis, where, Andrew Cartmell says, I didn't realise it was pretty much the same plot as Remembrance of the Daleks. I think, how is that possible? You were the script editor of the show. And so not only is it a sort of an underwhelming story, it retreads pretty much beat for beat something that happened earlier in the season with the Daleks in a much more successful way.
Yeah, it does. And it also kind of makes the Cybermen guest stars or second tier in what should be their story. They are competing for story time, not only with the Doctor as they should, but with Lady Painfort, with the Nazis and DeFlores, and because they're also need to be sort of competing with these other baddies, they almost sort of brought down so they're on par with these baddies. So, okay, one of them's playing with machine guns, one of them's playing with bows and arrows. Yes, gold and poison tipped and all the rest of it, but the Cybermen kind of have to be drawn down to a level where they are an equal third of the story. And that is unfortunate. This story also highlights for me probably the biggest problem I have with the Cybermen of this era, and that is that they don't feel like the Silver Giants of the 60s. You look at the way the Cybermen in the 60s just tower over people. They tower over Hartnell, they definitely tower over Troughton. Now, Sylvester McCoy is not a particularly tall actor. I think he's shorter than I am, and I'm certainly not very tall. But I never get that sense of the Cybermen really sort of towering over him. And indeed, when they play against Colin and Peter, they almost sort of go eyeball for eyeball.
Yeah, it's something that is lost from the 60s, where a big thing was made about their height, wasn't it? They were over 7 foot tall. They were the Silver Giants.
Yeah.
And I mean, David Banks is a tallish guy, but it doesn't seem that being a particularly tall person was a prerequisite for the actors they hired in the 80s.
No, it wasn't, and I think that is a shame. I think that is lost. I also think that Silver Nemesis suffers from the cuts that were made, again, because it was just so overcrowded. You look at a lot of stuff that even wasn't in the extended edition that is a cut from that, and that has a lot more of the stuff about what the Cyberman did with DeFlores and his henchmen and the partial conversions and sort of going down that sort of path, similar to what they did in Attack. I think Saywood in Attack tries to bring that back with Lytton's policeman being cybertized in the first episode, Lyndon himself being partially cybertized and meeting the offcut sort of the rejected cyber conversions.
Yeah.
I think that's actually a really clever and good use of the Cybermen that is perhaps a little bit forgotten because it is such a dense, continuity-heavy sort of story.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It is interesting, those guys, on Telos, working out in the, I want to say in the fields, but it's not really the fields, is it? It's just kind of this rocky sort of
in the
crappy
quarry,
place. In the quarry. These guys in the quarry. So they are halfway to being Cybermen, but because they haven't got the helmets on and they're still human, they can have human conversations. And it's that interesting halfway point, I think, which, not enough probably does get made of that, actually, in Attack of the Cybermen.
No, but certainly the conversion process is shown to be a nasty one, and that does add to the threat of the Cybermen in that story. Yeah.
So, look, rounding out the 80s, Dave, I do want to mention their appearance in the Five Doctors. I jotted down too, Cybermen do get a mention in the War Games and Carnival of Monsters for a couple of extra 60s and 70s appearances, but it's really the Five Doctors in the 80s where they do get a fairly lengthy scene where they get massacred by the Raston Warrior robot and Pertwee gets to sort of share sort of screen time with them. He's watching this happen.
Yes, it's a very cool set of scenes. The Cybermen get to be the big villain of the story in a way that the Daleks weren't, which is kind of cool. Terrence Dix gets to write them and has fun basically massacring Eric Saywood's favourite monster just to make a bit of fun of Eric Saywood, which is sort of, that lovely thing between writers. It works very well, and I like them in the Five Doctors.
Yeah, I just thought it was worth a quick mention there before we move on to New Who.
Cool. Well, let's move on to New Who then.
New Who, Dave. Ugh. There is a great story in here. There's an alright story, and the rest I'm not too fussed about at all.
Yeah, look, I've said a number of times, and I stand by this, I think there are classic monsters that the New Who has done extremely well, and the Daleks are top of that list. There are classic monsters that the new series has not done very well, and the Cybermen, sadly, are top of that list. Maybe I'm being a bit harsh, I don't know. I think there's, as you said, one absolute classic. I think we both agree it's World Enough and Time, The Doctor Falls.
Yes.
I don't like the robotic uniform stomping nature of the Cybermen. I just think it's corny and cheesy. I've got over with time the fact that these are not the Cybermen of our universe, but are the Cybermen of an alternate universe with a completely different creation story. When that first happened, I was sort of like, oh, they can't do that now. Yeah, well, of course they can. Who cares? I've got over that. But then you sort of get into the Moffat era, and it's like, well, we've now just got fleets of Cybermen going around because, sure, it all doesn't quite work, but let's not be slaves to continuity. I think the problem with the Cybermen in the new era is they just don't have many awesome stories.
I just don't understand how initially Russell T Davies doing Rise of the Cybermen, Age of Steel, Army of Ghosts, Doomsday, The Next Doctor, how someone like that can be so steeped in Doctor Who lore and understand innately what Cybermen are and what their premise is and not want to ramp that up. I don't understand that at all, and I've never seen it addressed in interviews. I've never seen someone put it to him. Like, do you just not get them, or do you get them and wanted to make them robots instead? Like,
but surely, Rob, that is simply an example of modern sensibilities. You couldn't do the body horror stuff of the 60s sort of Cyberman concept in a modern audience. I mean, you just can't in a family-friendly audience. Surely it is Russell T Davies making a decision he makes consistently in his time as a showrunner, which is what's going to appeal to the mass audience. And I think in that sense he made the right call. It doesn't work for me. I'm not the mass audience, though.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things to say to that is, well, look, World Enough and Time did it and people loved it.
Did people love it or did we love it? like it's an unprovable. I'm being deliberately difficult on this one, but it is an unprovable.
Yeah, that's fine. Well, the second thing I was going to say was, in the Russell T Davies era, he does show people being lined up and marched into a room where they're just going to be hacked to pieces by saws and things, and their heads, their brains are going to end up in these cyber units. And I think that's kind of body horror. It's kind of showing what's happening. It's kind of showing that they're not robots. But then on screen, they just act like robots and do march in unison like they're Soviet-era soldiers. And it's just... I don't get this. I really don't get it.
I think Age of Steel and Rise of the Cybermen does pull back from where it could have gone, and I think it must be deliberate. That scene of the mass cyber conversions is sort of covered with what I thought was almost a cartoonish sort of set of graphics and ideas, flying sort of scissors through the air and laser beams and people screaming in the background. I get what they were doing. I get that's probably as far as they could go. I think it falls short. I would have liked to see a bit more made of this idea of the fact that all the first people converted into Cybermen were the homeless and the unwanted, in inverted commas, from society, the leftovers of society, the poorest of society. I thought that was a really interesting thing that they could have done and they kind of pulled back from.
Which was something he was retreading from the final Eccleston story where, the Emperor Daleks talking about how they took the refugees and they filleted them and, turned them into Dalek and so on. So Davis is almost, cribbing from his own work there.
Yeah, but I think it works better as a concept with the Cybermen. I mean, there are some very wonderful moments. I think that moment of the creation turning on the creator is done very well there. The Lumix, I will convert only with my last breath, then breathe no more. That's a wonderful moment. There is some wonderful visuals in there. It's not terrible. We're probably pounding it more than I think we mean to. Again, they probably captured the public imagination to a reasonable extent, so it wasn't a success in that sense. Yes. Again, I just don't think these stories are as good as they could have been.
No, not at all. I mean, something like Closing Time, I think, is successful as a comedy piece, although we have sort of already seen most of that shtick done already in The Lodger. The Cybermen are almost, tacked onto the end of that story, as I recall.
Yeah, I think Closing Time is an example of a perfectly watchable 42 minutes of television that's kind of imminently forgettable. And by that stage, probably a lot of the ideas had been done before, and it did feel very familiar.
Nightmare in Silver, I think, let's get Neil Gaiman on board. He's a fantastic writer. The last time he wrote for Doctor Who, it was amazing. Let's give him the Cybermen. This will be just incredible. And it just falls on its face. I couldn't believe that.
You see, I actually really enjoyed Nightmare of Silver.
Really?
Yeah, I remember watching that and thinking, oh wow, this is the first good episode in ages. I mean, this is possibly the best of the season. I'm really enjoying this. And then sort of going on social media and finding, oh wow, not many people agree with me on this one. Wow, it was really interesting.
Yeah,
I actually like that Matt Smith scene. I think it was a really good idea and good attempt to do something interesting with the Cybermen. I think giving them an extra physical ability, is it a bit cheesy? Sure, but at least they're trying to do something a bit different and making them less of a clunking roboty thing. I thought it was a perfectly good, fun adventure that did interesting things with the Cybermen.
Yeah, look, don't get me wrong. There are elements of it I like. I liked the setting for it. I thought was quirky and interesting. And there's some great lines in it because Gaiman is a great writer. But on the whole, it just fell flat for me. But not as flat, Dave, as Darkwater, Death in Heaven. Are you triggered?
I'll say it.
Yes.
Worst story ever.
Yeah, it's not good.
Look, it's not good. I mean, once again, the Cybermen are second fiddle in the story. They are second to what Missy's doing. They're kind of just there because, well, I'm not quite sure why. But again, some good moments. That idea of seeing the skeletons in the water and not realising they're Cybermen because you can only see that stuff, and then as the water disappears, you see they're Cybermen. I thought that was a really clever idea, a really obvious idea, but a clever one. The door shutting to have the eyes was a really good moment. I pay them that. But the flying Cybermen, that looked terrible.
Yeah, I think Moffat's just looked at his kids playing with Iron Man toys and thought, I've got an idea.
Look, I don't want to beat this story up. I do that often enough. It doesn't work for me. I think the Cybermen are kind of there as an afterthought, it doesn't quite work. I think the stuff with Cyber Danny, I can see what he's trying to do, and I just think it completely misses the mark. The Cyber Brigadier is terrible. It's an awful, horrible concept. The way the Cybermen are kind of created by... it just doesn't work for me, Rob. If I'm being generous, I can kind of see what he was trying to do, but it just doesn't work, and it's just a horrible, nasty story.
Yeah, it's going to rain, and then the dust that's in people's graves, these are graves that have been around for a while. People are just going to be dust in them, Dave. Somehow that can become a Cyberman. Oh, yeah, forget it.
Yeah.
Look, before we get on to other media, I just want to briefly sort of look at where we've been so far. We've looked at the 60s, where there were more stories than in the 70s and 80s combined, and we both seem to like the 60s more than the 70s and 80s. And then in New Who, we're not too fussed with most of the stories, except for World Enough and Time and the Doctor Falls, which we think is brilliant. So it's all over the shop when it comes to Cybermen on TV.
It is. There is a lack of consistency there, I think, because they are a very difficult monster to get hold of as a concept. The Daleks, as cool a concept as they are really easy. These bubbling lumps of hate inside a suit of armour that just goes around exterminating everything because they're space Nazis, basically. Like, it's not hard to say these are robotic space Nazis and have someone go, I can do that. Whereas the Cybermen are very hard. You know, what is their motivation? What is their background? How much do you pull in the body horror stuff? There are lots of different ways you can go with the Cybermen.
Well, do we say they're space communists, Dave? Because everyone's got to be the same.
Yeah. I've certainly heard that interpretation given to them. I think there is some merit in it, but I think given that we're on record as having Kit Pedler talk about his inspiration being what is the natural extension of the cybernetic process, that is difficult to sustain, certainly conceptually. Did they become similar to that in some stories? Yes, but I think we need to say first and foremost it was that logical extension of, well, where do cybernetics go? Okay, we now can replace certain organs with cybernetic replacements. At what point do you lose your humanity? What percentage of your body needs to be human to remain human? And is the logical extension of that, well, we can replace the heart and the lungs when they get sick. Why don't we just replace them before they get sick? And if we're replacing the other organs, well, do we replace the brain? Like that's a wonderful classic science fiction concept of take an idea and take it further. And the one thing I'll give the new series credit for is that they occasionally have asked the question, what is the cybernetics of today?
Yes.
So they take that concept of everybody going around connected to the internet, wearing earpods, sort of absorbed in their own world, and say, right, let's take that a bit further. I don't think it lands quite as well as the cybernetics does, but I do give them credit for exploring those options. And maybe the story of the Cybermen in New Who is a story of explorations that just don't always land as well. They're trying to do something new and original, and it's just never quite lands as well as it could, with a couple of exceptions.
Yeah, well said. Look, shall we move on to other media?
Look, let's do this. And you've noted down the first thing here, Rob, which is something that was a massive deal in fandom, certainly when I was very young, and that is David Banks' Cyberman book.
Yeah, absolutely. I was so excited the first time, and probably the second and third time I saw advertisements for this in Doctor Who Monthly. It was like, this book is coming, it's written by David Banks. Information on the Cybermen was reasonably thin on the ground. I mean, we knew sort of the Kit Pedler side of the story and the real sort of background of the Cybermen, but was there a sort of a fictional backstory? Well, no, there wasn't much of one. Only what had been teased out of individual stories with, a line here and a line there. And as we talked about, even between the 60s and Revenge of the Cybermen, there's quite a difference in what's going on. So this was the first time that a coffee table, hard-covered book was going to come out with loads of information in it, and that was very, very exciting.
It was very exciting. It's helped by the fact that it is a gorgeous book. It is very well put together. It's got wonderful artwork all the way through it by Andrew Skilleter. Really, really wonderful artwork. But it's got three sections. One section really talks about cybernetics and what inspired the Cybermen in a real-world sense. One section talks about the cyber stories in a production background sort of sense. What was it like putting them together? And David Bakes particularly pulls on his own experiences of why they wear particular makeups and how particular decisions were made and how costumes worked. And they do a sort of a production thing. But the most famous section, the one that really captured my brain as a Doctor Who monster book, nerdy sort of 10, 11, 12-year-old, however old I was when I first got it, is, as you said, this fictional narrative that links all the Cybermen stories together. It pictures an evolution of the Cybermen, the ones that were developed on Mondas, and then the splinter group that went away because they wanted to be harder core, more pure Cybermen. So they went away and become the Cybermen that you see in the Invasion, and they grow through and become the Troughton ones, and eventually go into their tombs, and then another one goes off to explore space, and that's the ones that become the Revenge Cybermen, and the last of the Revenge Cybermen meets up with the ones left over in the tombs, and they merge to create the 80s Cybermen. Like, it's this wonderful, glorious, conceited narrative that is so fanboyish, and I love it so much.
Yeah, look, well said. And I took a long time to get a copy of the book. I didn't get it as a 13-year-old or 14-year-old, whatever age I was at the time, because, it was a hardcover book shipping from the UK. You just didn't do that in the late 80s. It was just a foreign territory. Now I buy things online from the UK every other day of the week, But
yes, no, look, I've got the locally printed paperback, and I certainly did get it a couple of years after it hit the shelves in the UK, because, it was very expensive. You sort of had to wait until there was a slightly discounted paperback, locally printed version that we could afford, Yeah, so I'd looked at friends' versions, I'd borrowed a version from the library, but now I'm happy to say I own a hardcover first edition of the Cyberman book. I'm very happy with it. Yeah, look, it is a wonderful book. I can't recommend it highly enough. Now, Dave, something else, and this is not a book. We're going to talk about a few books here, but this is an actual TV episode, but not of Doctor Who. It's of Torchwood. It's a Chris Chibnall story as well. Do you remember Cyberwoman? I definitely remember watching it. It's a very widely panned story. Let me ask you one question, Rob. Would this story be much, much better regarded, and potentially regarded as a very interesting and quite cool idea, if it wasn't for the terrible design of the Cyberwoman costume? Oh, I think so, Dave. I think if this had an element of body horror to it, I know we've gone on about that a bit, but if this lady was, half in a cyber suit and half out of it, and, maybe had some, maybe was missing a limb, or I'm not trying to be gross or, well, I think scare our listeners, but, I think Lytton from the end of Attack of the Cybermen. Yeah, I mean, that's fair. Just something nasty, whereas the outfit is very, very sexy. Or it's meant to be sexy. It's someone's idea of what sexy is, but in reality it actually doesn't look that sexy. I'll qualify that. It shows a lot of flesh. It's a very weird thing. I think it's just like those early days of Torchwood. Let's be sexy and let's, be different to Doctor Who. And it falls into that sort of rabbit hole, and it just makes a mess of what, actually could have looked a lot better. Yeah, and it's actually a little bit embarrassing to watch, because there's just this woman walking around in a cyber bikini, because why not? Yeah. When as I said, the idea of somebody being partially cybernized, like that's a really cool concept to hang something off, and where is their loyalty now, and how does a loved one feel about somebody who's gone through that process? It's there's a lot of good in there. Plus, there's a cool pterodactyl. Its reputation, I think, is almost entirely from the look, and that's a fair judgment, frankly. Yeah, absolutely. I haven't got much more to say about it. It's not a great episode of Torchwood, and the design is woeful. Absolutely. So in the Wilderness Years, the Cybermen did pop up as well. Unlike the Daleks, which Virgin never got the rights to do in the New Adventures and the Missing Adventures, they did have the ability to use the Cybermen. Used very sparingly, though. They didn't come up. They didn't sort of become substitute Daleks. They get used in the new adventure Iceberg, which is a McCoy story, written by David Banks. I think this is a really fun adventure. And look, it is very continuity heavy. David Banks draws from his Cyberman book narrative and chronology and uses that. But the premise is very much that the Cybermen who were left over from the invasion have crashed down in the polar region, and they've sort of been building up a project to start again. And it goes from there. It's got some really cool features, and the Cybermen are really scary. I really like this book.
Yeah, and it's not one I've read, but it has a notorious reputation, so I'm looking forward to reading it at some stage.
It is also the one that has got some pretty excessive use of bad language.
That's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, and was the one after which they said, okay, we need to actually pull this back a bit. But it's a shame it's remembered for that, because that is actually only a very minor part of what is a very good story. And the other is one that you bought recently, Rob.
I have bought recently, still haven't read, but I've heard your glowing words about it, Dave, and I do look forward to reading it.
And that is, of course, The Missing Adventure, The Killing Ground, which is a Colin Baker story set after Trial of a Time Lord. So when he's got his new companion, Grant, and they go to Grant's home planet, which was a cyber, basically, farm, where they had colonies of humans that they essentially allowed to breed and multiply and grow, and once a year they'd come take the biggest and the strongest and the best of them so they could go off and become Cybermen. It's a chilling concept. And what is really interesting is that the premise of it is then, well, the humans say to beat the Cybermen, we need to kind of beat them at their own game, so they create their own suits of cybernized armor, and it goes from there. And I have to mention, and I have mentioned this before, so apologies to long-term listeners who are sick of me going on about how good this is, but the notorious scene of somebody narrating their cybernization is one of the most memorable in the range. It is a really good use of Cybermen, and Colin's Doctor going up against them, I think, is a really good idea.
Yeah. Would it make a good TV episode?
It would, but it would have to be done with a PG rating and go out after 8 o'clock. You couldn't do that for Sunday tea time viewing. You absolutely couldn't.
Okay. Moving into the PDA range, Dave, these are the past Doctor Adventures, essentially the MAs, just when they moved to BBC Books. There is a story called Illegal Alien. And if I asked you, picture a doctor and a female companion, it's World War II, it's the Blitz, and something mysterious has fallen from the sky, would you be thinking of perhaps The Empty Child and the Doctor Dances?
You could be, very much, yes.
You could be. But no, this is the plot of Illegal Alien, and it's not really like the Empty Child and the Doctor Dances, it's just that premise sort of seems similar. I think this is everything that Silver Nemesis could have been, because, it's got the Doctor and Ace, it's got Nazis, it's got Cybermen. This is how you do it. And indeed, I think this was even touted to be a story for the 1990 season, and just didn't get up. Maybe the script or the treatment didn't even come along too much, but it was certainly a thought in the author's mind at the time, I know, and it could have been great, I think.
Yeah. So very very quickly, Mike Tucker did write a submission to Andrew Cartmell around about the time that season 26 was in production.
There you go.
He sent it in anonymously, and then was talking to Ben Aronovich, and he said, "Hey, I've seen the script. Would you have a look at it?" And Ben Aronovich said, "Oh yeah, sure." And he said, "Look, here's my thoughts." And Mike Tucker said, "Well, actually, I wrote it." He said, "Oh, look, well, if you did it, mate, let me have a second read and really give you a lot of insight into it," because Cartmell was pretty busy actually, script editing the series. And out of that, Tucker got some very, blunt advice about what worked and didn't. He was going to pitch it for season 27. There was no 27. So yeah, later on he turned the concept into a book, and it's a very fun story. It uses the Troutineer as Cybermen. It puts them into World War II London, and it gives McCoy and Ace a good adventure with the Cybermen. It's a good book.
That was one of the things I liked about it, because on television the Cybermen keep evolving and stuff, whereas I liked seeing a Doctor with an older Cyberman opposite them, which is also the case in Killing Ground, right?
That's right, yes.
Yeah. Moving on from the PDAs, the NSAs have a story called Plague of the Cybermen, which is a Matt Smith and the Cybermen story. I own the book. I've not read it, so I can't really comment on it. I don't think you have any NSAs, do you, Dave?
No, I haven't, no.
No. Which really just leaves Big Finish, and I don't think we can end this part of the Cyberman feature without mentioning Spare Parts for Big Finish, which is possibly the most famous Big Finish story ever. I think people who barely know Big Finish seem to know Spare Parts. It is a fantastic story, and it's a Davo story.
It is very good. I think it falls apart a bit in the last episode, and I know that I'm in a minority when I say that. But yes, the first 3 parts are excellent.
Yeah,
and it gives the Davison crew something to do, and it does purport to be that genesis of the Cyberman story, and delivers pretty well on that concept. I think it's the story that a lot of fans wish we could have had.
Well, we sort of had it in World Enough in Time. We had the spooky hospital, we had the decrepit sort of landscape and town and stuff. You know, there were elements of Spare Parts in World Enough in Time, don't you worry.
Oh, absolutely, but that came after Spare Parts. I think Spare Parts' reputation comes from the fact that at the time...
Oh, yes.
There was nothing like it.
Nothing at all. Nothing at all. Similar to that NSA Plague of the Cybermen, something else I haven't seen but I'm well aware of, there are 2 series of a Cyberman series on Big Finish, not involving the Doctor at all. And these seem quite interesting, possibly quite political. Dave, I don't know if you've had a listen to these at all. I haven't, but they're ones I've long thought about buying.
I'm in the same boat as you, Rob. I think the next time I do a Big Finish buy, they'll probably be in the batch that I buy, but I don't do those buys very often.
Yeah.
But yeah, very curious to hear what Big Finish does with the Cybermen.
Yeah, my take on those is, without being encumbered with having to write the Doctor into the story, I think there could be some really interesting stuff going on there.
Yeah, I think so too. Maybe some listeners who have read them will write in and give us a couple of comments for others to hear about.
That would be very cool. Yeah, I'd appreciate it. So, Dave, in summary, you know, we've talked around the eras, we've talked around the stories, we've talked around concepts, we've mentioned Kit Pedler's ideas, we've covered a lot of ground in not very long an episode. In summary, what do we think of the Silver Giants?
I think when they land, they're phenomenally good.
Yes.
I think that they are a much tougher concept to land than a lot of other monsters are, and that perhaps people appreciate that they are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that they do rise and fall a lot on the quality of the story around them, in a way when the Daleks can perhaps boost a story, or perhaps the production team goes all out on one of their stories. But at their best, there are a lot of Cyberman classics. Whether they use the Cybermen well or they just use them as robots, at the end of the day, I actually don't care that much. I can nuance it a bit and talk about it, but look, just go through 10th Planet, Moonbase, Tomb, Wheel, Invasion, Earthshock, Attack, World Enough in Time, you know, even into the Cybermen, which I like, Rise of Cybermen, which I get the adventure of. I quite like Nightmare in Silver. There's a lot of just really, really, really good Cyberman stories out there, and they deserve their reputation. Rob, you started this conversation, and I know you've got a big soft spot for the Silver Giants, so I'll give the last word to you.
Thank you, Dave. I'm thrilled that each era has good Cyberman stories. For a long time, it looked like New Who might have let the team down, because there wasn't really too much emerging there until World Enough in Time. But now that we have that, we can look at the 60s being brilliant, Revenge in the 70s not being too bad, the 80s having, you know, its own appeal, and finally New Who having its own great story. So, yes, there has been great stories in all these eras, but they do, in between some of these stories, do drop down a bit. They do rise and fall, as you say, and that's disappointing. I believe the concept of the Cybermen that I have in my head more so than some of the stories I watch, and I look forward to each new Cyberman story coming up, and there's another one coming up in, you know, this next season of Whittaker. I look forward to seeing if they can excite me again. You know, that's the beautiful thing. Just like there'll always be another Doctor, there will always be another Cyberman story at some stage, and you just see if it appeals or not. Because I'm sure some of these stories we've slated or aren't too keen on, other people absolutely love. You know, and even for me, I don't particularly like Nightmare in Silver, yet you do. So, you know, it's horses for courses sometimes.
And once again, if you're a listener who disagrees with our write us in and prompt some further discussion. We'd love to hear that. But no, Rob, I agree with what you've said there, and I do think that Jodie Whittaker versus the Cybermen has a huge amount of potential, and that's something I'm quite looking forward to seeing.
Yeah, she's small. She can play scared, maybe. I don't know how that will play out. I particularly don't know how they'll come up against her companions. Oh, let's not speculate. Let's move on.
Yeah, let's move on.